So welcome to PHS Live, More Than Just Leftovers, Rethinking the Value of Community Cookbooks in Library Collections. I'm Gabriella, and I'm one of the librarians at PHS, and I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Sharon. Give us a wave, Sharon. And our guest, thank you. And our guest, Dr. Heather Sharkey, who's a historian and professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Penn, where she's currently teaching a seminar on food in the Islamic Middle East. She also recently gave a virtual talk titled Let's Eat, the Social Consequences of Foods and Feasting at the Penn Museum, and she collects cookbooks. So tonight, in honor of National Library Week, which begins on April 4th, we're going to be focusing on books in the PHS collection. PHS is, pretty well known for its archives, but we actually also have a large collection of published materials, which includes over 90, it's right around 95 cookbooks that were published between 1873 and 2010. They're created mostly by churches in the US and then a handful of presbyteries and national church agencies. We actually have 26 different states represented in the cookbook collection. This session owes a lot to Sharon, who wrote a very funny and informative blog post about some of our cookbooks in December, and that link to that blog post is going to show up in the chat. We thought it would make a great topic for PHS Live, and actually, let me back up. The blog post kind of sparked a conversation between Sharon and Dr. Sharkey, and then we thought this would be a great topic for PHS Live. We're very grateful to have Dr. Sharkey here with us to discuss the cultural history of community cookbooks. Briefly, the format for today's session is going to be an informal Q&A, and then we're going with Dr. Sharkey, and then we're going to look at some examples from books in the PHS collection, as well as Dr. Sharkey's personal collection, which I know Sharon and I are both looking forward to because we haven't seen those yet. So I think that'll be a nice surprise for everybody. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and Sonia, who's moderating for us, is going to ask them at the end. We've got a lot of material, so we're going to try to keep it moving during the presentation itself. And we are recording this session. So if you know somebody's missing it because of the passcode issue or you need to step out, we're going to have a recording for you later that you'll get via email and on the website once it's ready. So, okay. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sharkey. I think I speak for both Sharon and myself when I say that as we started looking at our cookbooks and talking about them, we had many more questions than answers. And we could see lots of sort of threads that you could pull, to follow an idea and kind of paths of inquiry. So we're really grateful to have you here to help us. So to begin, when we first started talking about doing a PHS Live, you used the term community cookbooks to describe the kind of books we have at PHS. And that was a term we hadn't heard before, and I suspect some people in our audience haven't heard that either. So I guess to start, could you just say a little bit about what a community cookbook is, how they differ from other cookbooks, and then it's kind of a two-parter, what makes community cookbooks particularly useful or interesting as historical documents? What beyond the recipes for porcupine balls, which we have more than one recipe for porcupine balls in our particular cookbook collection. If you get beyond the recipes, what other kinds of things can we learn from community cookbooks?
Sorry, I'm off mute now. I'm delighted to be here and I'm excited to be here. I just wanted to also say that while I had a few community cookbooks in my own collection and always loved looking at them, I only really started to think about their importance as a scholarly source this past summer, when I read an amazing article by a woman named Ruby Watson, who used to be the director of the Peabody Museum at Harvard. She's an anthropologist who focuses on China. But it turns out she comes from Illinois, and she wrote this amazing and, for me, eye-opening article about community cookbooks in one county in northwestern Illinois where she grew up, and she focused on church cookbooks. So I could tell you some of the things that she said, which I think will be relevant to our conversation, but suffice it to say that when I read her article, it opened my eyes to the potential for the cookbooks as cultural sources. So I could talk more about that as we go on. But to respond to your first question, what is a community cookbook and what distinguishes it from other kinds of cookbooks? Really, there are a number of characteristics that we see. First of all, I would start by saying it's a very North American genre, found primarily in the United States and also Canada and the Caribbean, places like Jamaica and Trinidad and the Bahamas. So the English-speaking North America. It emerged, it seems, post-US Civil War, so late 19th century, and it's still, in fact, thriving today. Now, what makes them distinctive? First of all, they tend to be non-commercial publications. You'll see a lot of them are not printed in a very fancy way. So it's often inexpensive. More recent ones will have a kind of often a ring binding on it. What's really interesting about them is that they often serve a fundraising function. So people produce them with the idea of selling them for modest prices, and any proceeds go usually towards a charitable cause or to the support of a church or other community organization. They do not have a single author. This is part of what makes them community cookbooks. The contributors, on the one hand, are representing a community, but they themselves are also a community. So there are multiple contributors who submit recipes. What's also really interesting about them and distinguishes them from commercial cookbooks is that you'll often see duplicate recipes in the same cookbook. So you'll see, 15 different recipes for Jell-O molds, because I can tell you there's a law that there has to be Jell-O recipes, at least from the late mid 20th century onward. It's a law that there have to be a lot of those. And so you'll see like 5 pie crust recipes or, 7 meatloaf recipes in the same community cookbook, which you would not see in a commercial publication. I also like to think that community cookbooks reflect real food as opposed to aspirational dining. I mean, a lot of what people watch when they watch, cooking shows on TV or when they buy glossy cookbooks, a lot of times it's for looking, it's really fancy, it's really expensive. This community cookbooks, it's usually real people food. And it also reflects the fact that the contributors are often amateurs. And you will see in one cookbook, you can tell that there are varying degrees of cooking expertise. So some people in a single cookbook, you can tell, would be great cooks. And other people are putting canned everything and mixing it all, sloshing it together and sticking it in the oven. And so you'll see that. Another thing is that it's not only recipes for food, as Sharon has noted, and I hope she's going to be writing more about this. Sometimes there are humorous or joke recipes in a collection, and sometimes there are recipes for things like cleaning products or Play-Doh or a Christmas tree solution to keep your Christmas tree greener for longer. So you'll see that in there as well. Usually the contributors and compilers of community cookbooks have been women. So there's a very strongly gendered dimension to the cookbooks, although occasionally there will be male contributors. And they tend to be not from major metropolises. You will not see a lot of community cookbooks coming out of Midtown Manhattan. Instead, they're coming from rural areas, small towns, and mid-sized cities. And then finally, I would say, community cookbooks are for the formation of voluntary societies. And one point that I think is very relevant to Presbyterian history is that they arise from the same impulse, I would say, as missions, in the sense that they pull people together. It's a humble effort, modest fundraising goals, but the belief that the more people you have participating, the better it is. And it's from, again, a similar impulse. So while not all community cookbooks are from churches or indeed from synagogues or other religious organizations, some might be in theory from alumni associations or women's leagues in different towns, but they are often coming out of churches. And that's also a large part of where the community element in them comes from.
That's so interesting. Thank you for that incredible just like overview of what these things are. I didn't know that they were a uniquely North American genre, and that that sounds like the majority of them are from church groups as opposed to other, like, there are other kinds of societies, but church groups predominate, you would say, in the development of the genre. Like,
yeah, but there are robust community cookbook practices among Jewish American communities as well.
Okay. Yeah, that was another question we had, which we couldn't answer from our own collection, is do you find this in other, in other religions and non-Christian religions,
Yeah, and I think also the fact that it's an American tradition, so I think now we're starting to see, for instance, a couple of examples of mosques producing community cookbooks as well. So as the American population diversifies, I think we will be seeing more community cookbooks arise in that way.
And I noticed Sonia put the link to, there was a recent New York Times article about community cookbooks. Did you, and it's about, so for the audience, there's a link to it in the chat, and it was from last, I think, May, and it was about community cookbooks in the time of COVID. And it's just so relevant and interesting, and talking about how, in a time of scarcity, that's, people needed to husband resources, but people also have extra time on their hands during quarantine, and you're missing the sociability. So you're kind of bringing this community into being by reinvigorating this tradition of community cookbooks. So it's a really interesting read. I recommend to all of you.
Yeah, I loved that article. And you know what? I think another thing that community cookbooks reflect that people are missing right now is something that Ruby Watson commented on in her article, which is, and it's a sort of a fancy word, but commensality. The idea that a lot of community cookbooks represent the practice of people getting together for events, whether that's a Christmas party or, a wedding or a funeral banquet or something like different occasions when in the past people would come together. And I think that's part of what people are craving right now. And that's why this genre will feel very relevant. Also, a lot of community cookbooks reflect family practices. It's a very familial cooking culture, because you'll see people say, oh, I got this recipe from my grandmother or my aunt, or my uncle. And so I think there's that element that also makes it feel really relevant to our times.
Thank you. That's, yeah, lots to think about. Out of curiosity, we're going to look at your collection in a minute after we looked at some from PHS's collections, but can you just say a little bit about what drew you to these, or when you started collecting them for yourself?
Well, so I was thinking my very first community cookbook, and I've got a stack, so you'll have to apologize as I'm reaching around the coffee table. My sister gave me one of these for Christmas many years ago, and this is not from a church, but this is from a women's association in Virginia, and it was first published in 1958. I mean, I would always look at this with sort of this shocked, fascination. And I think that's what came through Sharon's article too, because one of the things you see coming out of the community cookbooks is how much tastes change. And so, and practices change. So I think what drew me to them initially was this kind of anthropological voyeurism of looking at what people were cooking in the past and how practices have changed, and other things that are so familiar, like actually seeing recipes for things made with, Campbell's soup or something like that. So yeah, so that's sort of what initially drew me to them. But then also, I mean, I mentioned this article that opened my eyes to the potential, and I'd just like to say a few things about what it is, what kind of serious scholarly information we can extract from these cookbooks, right? So this article by Ruby Watson about this county in Illinois discussed how you can trace through community cookbooks changes in transportation, technology, access to different foods. So she notices, for example, things like, when trains came in and how bread changed from rye and cornmeal to wheat. And when you can see how people look like they're starting to eat a lot more wheat and it's milled locally, versus when you can see wheat starting to come in on an industrial scale, or even things like the entry of oranges coming in from California. So the readier and easier access to citrus fruits and things like that. And you can trace all of this through these cookbooks, and changing gender dynamics and patterns of collective eating and so on. I mean, this cookbook, I was looking at it today, this Virginia one, the first one my sister gave me, and there's a recipe on page 51 for brain oysters, which consists of 6 sets of hog's brains, 6 cups milk, 6 teaspoons butter, and salt. You have to wash the brains thoroughly, removing all skin in cold water. Heat milk slowly when hot but not boiling. Add brains, butter, and salt. Cook slowly until brains are done. Serve with crackers or buttered toast from Mrs. M.H. Panel of Orange County. And it's like, who eats hog's brains, first of all, and who like has them hanging around like, oh, I'm going to boil some hog's brains, eating on crackers, you know, and it tells you something about access to things, right? So the way things have changed. Notice, I mean, this cookbook does not have a recipe for guacamole in it because, you know, there were no avocados in Virginia when they wrote this cookbook. So you can really see changes like that in real time. Yeah,
great. That's, I think that's a kind of a perfect segue to having Sharon show us some of the items in the PHS collection, because you have kind of pointed to a lot of things she's going to explore in a little bit more depth with reference to the wacky and diverse range of cookbooks we have. So I am going to turn things over to Sharon. So thank you so much, Dr. Sharkey.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sharkey, and thank you, Gabriella. Let me just, okay. So I just wanted to start this presentation by saying that late last autumn, when I first picked up one of the 2 cookbooks sitting on my catalog cart of to be cataloged works, I found myself feeling really dismissive. And you can call me an aberration, but I tend to anthropomorphize things, and the cookbooks, or what I've learned now from Dr. Sharkey to be termed community cookbooks, well, I associated them with the following words. I thought them to be dowdy, inelegant, and stale. Basically, I thought they were anything but fashionable and compelling. Yet, the curious baker and the cook in me felt compelled to give the pages of these, what I considered at the time, provincial books, a few turns. And I was actually in for a real surprise, because quickly the historian and the former cultural studies scholar in me surfaced, and I was feeling really inquisitive about what I was seeing. And the more I actually looked at and read through these publications, the more I saw the more themes I saw surfacing, and the more questions I found myself asking of these works. So this evening, in the course of this presentation, I'm going to briefly discuss some of the themes that I noted in the books in the PHS collections. This is by no means an exhaustive list, since my intent here is to whet your appetite and perhaps let you satiate yourself by doing some extra research if you're interested in a particular topic. And I also know that we don't have 4 hours or so to go through everything, but I nevertheless want to go over the topics that I've listed here on the left, which relate to the presence or absence of religion in community cookbooks, how race and diversity feature in the cookbooks, how gender roles are presented and defined in the cookbooks, which are the changing technologies that impact meal preparation, along with the use of various products or brands that make possible new types of dishes. Beyond the recipe, what are the less obvious, but the unequivocally instructional and culturally inculcating aspects of the cookbooks? And also I wanted to look briefly at how you can study place through a review of the advertisements featured in the community cookbooks. And also, because I was curious about this, I was looking at the publishing of these books. So there's some very do-it-yourself projects that Dr. Sharkey has already mentioned something about. And then there are ones that are more professionally bound and actually published by publishing companies. I found that actually either are strictly devoted to publishing cookbooks or the arms of publishing companies that devote themselves to cookbooks. And just before I move to the next slide, I just wanted to note this image on the right is the cover of a recipe book by a woman whose work is in our collection. It's actually not a published work. It's from her personal papers collection. The woman's name is Mary Tunney. And this is a really great cultural artifact to look at. Basically, she's created something of a collage scrapbook because she's cut and pasted all kinds of recipes from other people and put them in here and created her own community out of this. So if you're ever at PHS and you'd like to look at this in the reading room, I encourage it. So when looking more closely at the range of cookbooks in our collections, I noticed that aspects of religiosity ranged in the publications. So in certain cases, it featured only in the title, as we see in the example on the bottom left with Priscilla's Circle, where the congregation name, which is Trinity Church here, was printed on the cover, but when I went through the book, there were no other mentions of religion within the cookbook at all. Then there are other cases where religion appears implicitly in the form of different recipe names. So if we look on the right toward the top, we see gospel chicken, then in the center, heavenly strawberry angel cake, and toward the bottom right, pastor's party rounds. So in other cases, what I might call parody recipes are in the books where religion is explicit, as we see in the top left example with the scripture cake. And to be honest, this actual recipe is lost on me. I don't know if Dr. Sharkey or perhaps Gabriella or one of our audience members might be able to interpret what together these different biblical passages equate to, or what the greater meaning is that they in combination convey. So the next topic I wanted to point out relates to race and diversity in the cookbooks at PHS. As I was going through our collections, I kept asking who was being presented in these books, and in general, who was being represented in the recipes and how. And I also wanted to know what the representation of various races and ethnicities in these publications, or the noted absence of diversity, said about the congregations, about the communities they were in, and about history in general. So in this first slide, I wanted to highlight one of two themes I kept encountering, and that is of members of communities, sometimes the congregational communities, but sometimes just geographic communities around the congregation. They were contributing recipes from their own cultural backgrounds as immigrants, or often as those coming from non-mainstream American immigrant past. So here, if we go clockwise, we see a Dutch recipe at the top, a Korean recipe at the far right, more toward the center, a Middle Eastern recipe, and on the left, a Native American recipe. In this second slide, by contrast, I've highlighted some examples of cookbooks published over the decades by the national church. So this is a little different than the community cookbooks we've been looking at and we'll look at more of. Through these examples, though, we can trace the trajectory of how the church has represented diversity over time. At the top right, there's the cover image of a 1941 missionary publication called Around the US on a Cookbook. And right to the left of that, I have two excerpts from text in this book. So this is actually a highly appropriative publication, meaning that this book was envisioned and created by those outside of the various communities from which the recipes were collected. Then at the bottom right is a cookbook titled Cooking Third World Women. It's a 1970 publication by the Third World Women's Coordinating Committee. And although this is somewhat less appropriative in terms of the language inside, it's still othering individuals from outside communities and doing so from this dominant hegemonic viewpoint of white culture. And the name of the cookbook alone, in my opinion, speaks in a stentorian voice to this kind of appropriation and hegemony. In the last, most recently published case, if we look at the upper left-hand portion of the screen, is the cover of a 2010 publication titled Racial Ethnic Cookbook by the Committee of Women of Color, Justice for Women. And so here we see women of color and women from various racial groups and ethnic communities featured in the book contributing their own recipes or collecting recipes from their own communities. So thus, in this example, we're actually able to see how the national church has evolved to develop a more responsible, less appropriative approach to the production of a racially and ethnically diverse cookbook. So not surprisingly, the concept of gender, as Dr. Sharkey mentioned, the gender roles, along with the idea of gendered spaces, features prominently in the cookbooks at PHS. For one, the very production of these cookbooks relied on the planning and collection efforts of women's groups. Also, in nearly every case, although there are some exceptions, the recipes are contributed by women. So it wasn't so much surprising for me as it was interesting for me to watch women shed the possessive and honorific Mrs. And they move from contributing their recipes under Mrs. and then their husband's name to just using their first and last names. So if we look toward the center, we see a slide from 1880, or an image from 1887. And we have Mrs. J.H. Brent, so she fully takes her husband's name. But then if we look at the bottom left, the apple cake, this is from a 1920s publication where I first started to see changes. So some women, as in Miss Edith Harvey, are going by Miss, and then there were actually some other women in this particular cookbook that just went by their first and last names. But then by the 1960s, I typically saw recipes just being contributed by women going by their first and last names only, as we see in 1977 on the bottom right by Miss Peggy Goodenough. So also, as I spent more time going through the cookbooks in the collection, I had to wonder where the men were or if they were there at all. And certainly, as I'm sure you have as well, I've met many men, or I've learned about plenty of men the world around who are excellent cooks and bakers, and they don't want to just be tied to a grill. And yet, it was not only really hard, and it took me quite a while to find men in the PHS collections at all, but when I did find a few, primarily their place was still tied to the patio or terrace with a grill. So in this slide, we see men. At the bottom right, there's a 1972 cookbook, and it featured a 2.5-page chapter at the very end titled "For Men Only, What's Cooking?" And if you look at the image on the right-hand side of this page, it is from that chapter. And its introductory paragraph places men primarily at the grill, without air conditioning, enduring pesky insects and the hot temperatures, leaving their wives inside, and apparently they very seldom, although they occasionally will be found stepping foot in the kitchen. And then I was really fascinated to find, this only started happening in the 1980s, at least through our collections, that there would be the occasional man who contributed by with a recipe, such as in the bottom left. This is from a 1981 publication. And then you can see evidence of this phenomena as well, again, in the example in the center. This is from an early 1990s publication. So in this slide, I have highlighted another theme I noted running throughout the community cookbooks. Beyond just the ingredient lists and the how-tos of dish preparation, I saw forms of instruction that extended into various aspects of culture. So here, toward the bottom left, are suggested menu items for various types of events or menus supposedly suited for particular groups, be they family dinners, breakfast or brunch, for serving to crowds, or to serve when hosting afternoon tea or a children's party, as examples show here. And also peppered throughout these books are things like wine pairing and candy making tips. And there's also sometimes some interesting instructions, such as we see at the bottom right-hand side of this slide, where it actually tells you how to properly phrase your sentences when becoming aware of an opportunity to help. And the other thing that I found really interesting was that in the 19th century works, which if you look at the center right, with where it says food for the sick, there were sections on how to prepare foods to help naturally heal ailments of various kinds. And in the 20th century, I didn't see this at all. And this is a personal interest of mine, but I would be really curious to know like why exactly these disappeared, and if these types of recipes have again resurfaced as people have become more interested and alternative means of health and natural healing. So in this slide, I just wanted to highlight a few additional types of instruction that I found in the community cookbooks. Here we see instructions on napkin folding, a skill I've clearly never learned besides folding a napkin in half. So I was really rather surprised and impressed by the instructions for constructing a napkin in the shape of an artichoke. And on the right-hand side, we also see instructions for properly setting a table for both luncheons and dinners. And I have to say that until I read this, I had no idea actually how to properly set a luncheon table setting. So next to come out of the kitchen are a plethora of examples that speak explicitly in some cases and implicitly in others to the en vogue, the hot new technologies of the time. So at the upper left-hand corner, we see a 1980s publication with a chapter or with a page from the cookbook in which microwavable recipes are specifically featured. And then I also found sprinkled liberally throughout many of the other cookbooks from this era recipes for microwave dishes. So for your edification and perhaps your amusement, I've included a couple here, especially the one at the top with microwaved refrigerator pickles. And I can't say that I ever thought about making pickles in a microwave. But beyond the microwave, if you look closely at the recipes from the various decades, starting back in the 1880s moving forward, of course, you can start to note, as I did, shortening cooking times for dishes. So these shortened cooking times and baking times speak to other technological changes and advances in gas cooking and electric stoves and ovens, as well as different types of bakeware and cookware, as with Pyrex. And one thing I wanted to point out, which will segue me to the next slide, is in the bottom right there, I have highlighted oleo under the microwave caramel corn. And to be honest, I didn't know what oleo was, so I looked it up, and it made me think about what I've put on this next slide, which is the creation, production, and distribution of more and more processed food products, often products associated with a brand name, and along with these products, newly developed recipes. So in the blog article that I wrote last December, and when spending more time with community cookbooks, I've really become interested, sometimes peevishly, in the recipes themselves. Often the titles would include the name of a brand of a food I was unfamiliar with. Sometimes recipes including ingredients like I'd never heard of, or processed brand items like Tang, which I wrote about in the blog article, that I didn't even know were still being manufactured. So this made me think a lot about societal changes that were happening, especially in the 20th century, that made people, especially women, want to make quick meals with certain products, like we see in the advertisement for Kraft dinners, home cooked in 7 minutes. I thought a lot about what food or products fall in and out of fashion over time, and about where and what markets certain products are sold and still used versus in what markets these products have disappeared. Is this geographic? I could go on about marketing to demographics and fads and health, but as you can see, there's a lot of content here to be looked at. So on this slide, I just wanted to quickly point out the number of the cookbooks in our collection feature selections of advertisements. They appear to have been placed by community-based businesses who are contributing to either maybe a capital project of a church or a charitable fund that was driving the production of the dissemination of the community books in the first place. And these might not be of interest to everyone, but they can certainly prove useful artifacts for study if someone is interested in learning more about the communities in which the congregations were placed. And finally, as someone who's created a few zines in my lifetime, and as someone who does creative bookbinding on occasion, I was really interested in how these community cookbooks varied in terms of their publication and binding. So as one of my favorite examples here on the left illustrates, it was a very DIY, do-it-yourself project. It's a creative solution. This is actually Xeroxed 1982, was bound in wallpaper. And at first I thought, well, that's an interesting approach. It's quite creative, but it was probably inexpensive, and wallpaper is actually durable and washable, I thought. And I was also interested to find out, and I am admittedly very naive about this topic, but that there were publishers in existence who specialized in publishing community cookbooks. So as you can see on the right, some cookbooks even included extra leaves at the end, advertising the publisher and encouraging groups to create published community cookbooks. So with that, I would like to pass you back to Dr. Sharkey, who will unequivocally serve you the most delectable dessert portion of this evening's presentation.
Thank you, Sharon. That was fantastic. And I think we don't have that much time left. And I know I want to keep, how much time do we have? How much time would I have to talk about some Middle East?
I mean, we started a bit late because of the technology issues. So I think we should go to 6:05. You know, we started 5 after the hour, so that gives us 20 minutes.
Great. So I'll just, can I highlight a few things in some of my collection to add on to what Sharon just said, which was amazing. So very recently, I've become interested in Middle Eastern American cookbooks because I'm a historian of the Middle East and Islamic world. And I see that in the chat, there was a question about what are the oldest ones in my collection, and they're actually not that old. I'm working with this with some colleagues, but Middle Eastern American cookbooks really only started appearing in the mid-20th century. And so it's a lot later than community cookbooks in general. And most of the ones that I have found recently are just from the last 25 years. And there's also a reason for that, which is also points to the strength of the Presbyterian Historical Society's collections, which is that community cookbooks tend to be highly ephemeral. If, as Sharon said, people are making them out of wallpaper and Xeroxing them, there aren't going to be a lot of copies. So even if there were earlier ones, how would we get it? Who's going to be selling it, especially if they were things circulated internally within communities? So again, mine are very recent, but it just goes to show how valuable these are. The earliest reference I found so far to a Middle Eastern American community cookbook is from about 1963, and I do not have that yet myself, but I'm going to be following that up. All of my cookbooks are from Middle Eastern American Catholic and Orthodox church communities, not Protestant communities. And I have a few to show you, and I want to flag a couple of interesting things. This one is from St. Anne Parish in Danbury, Connecticut. It's a Melkite church, a Melkite Catholic church. And I appreciate Georgette Ayub, who worked on it, sent a copy to me at my request. And it has a couple of different recipes for Lenten stuffed grape leaves. One of the things that makes Middle Eastern American cookbooks so interesting is that they do tend to include more foods for Lent, which are vegan. And so you see one cool thing is different Christian cultural practices coming through the recipes, but you also see in cookbooks like this evidence for immigration, intermarriage, and neighborly relations. So you can see in this cookbook, which comes out of a church that was founded in 1910, the cookbook was published in 2012, and there are Italian, Ukrainian, and Polish recipes in here, as well as Syrian and Lebanese things for classics like hummus and tabbouleh. And you'll see that in a lot of them. This one is a community cookbook from St. George Maronite Catholic Church in San Antonio, Texas. This was a church that they immigrants founded in 1925. The Ladies Altar Society printed this in 2014. And it has, what's interesting about it is you can see the Americanization. In addition to canonical Middle Eastern foods, you see things like Mississippi mud cake and pumpkin whoopie pie and recipes for Super Bowl parties. And there's also, going back to Sharon's point about how some of the late 19th century cookbooks actually had medical recipes, what you see in this particular cookbook is a whole section on greener living with recipes for things like fabric softener and shower cleaner that are not going to harm the environment. And so this shows how the genre is changing to reflect new interests. I also wanted to show you This is one of the most recent of everyday Armenian cooking from an Armenian Orthodox Church community in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. And what's really touching about this Armenian cookbook is it strikes me as having the most connection to memory and nostalgia of the ones that I own, with many of the recipes coming from grandparents, in some cases from relatives who were survivors of early 20th century massacres. And you also see recipes from pilgrimage trips now, as well as service trips to Armenia. So you see connections to Armenia as an imagined land and now as a republic in a somewhat different geographical setting that comes through this cookbook very strongly. One thing before we open it up that I want to point out that I find particularly fascinating are some of the very distinctive Middle Eastern Christian cultural practices that I see in my small but hopefully growing collection. And I'd like to point out one recipe in particular. It's a recipe for funeral wheat. And I have it in two of these in this Orthodox church from Oklahoma City, St. Elijah, which this is the one where it's a 1998 cookbook, but there was a 1963 edition. This is a dish that is made with whole wheat and dried fruit and almonds. You boil the wheat and you then form it in after it's boiled and soaked with sugar and sweets, you form it, mound it on a platter, and you put the shape of a cross in it, and you serve this wheat for ceremonies in honor of the deceased. So it's a dish associated with mourning rituals that happens 40 days after a death. And there is another recipe in this Melkite cookbook for the same thing. And this one also suggests very similar sets of ingredients. You mount it on a platter, you make the shape of a cross with almonds on top, and then you put the initials of the deceased in the dish. The reason this fascinates me so much, I feel if I go on and do research, I'd love to do research on this dish, is because I went to a conference this summer held by the German Oriental Institute in Istanbul. It was an online conference where they had paper presenters discussing just this dish, which Muslims, Sunnis and Shia, as well as Jews in the Middle East and various Christians all prepare. So it's a very symbolically laden dish, and I find it a fascinating example of traditions carrying over and coming into the United States. We do see changes in the cookbooks, but this is a recipe that goes back hundreds of years where we can see continuities over time and connections to many different faith communities. So I'll end there, and I know other people will have questions.
Thank you so much. That's just tremendous, and such a interestingly different counterpoint to what we have at PHS. It's just, but it shows just how incredibly rich these are. So I guess it looks like people, so did you have questions for us from it looks like people mostly put them in the chat as opposed to the Q&A. So
yeah, we do have a couple of good questions. I try to keep track of the ones that have come in. One of the first ones that came in was, are there any recipes that were in the oldest books that we might still see today?
I think sweet potato casseroles. A lot of I think Thanksgiving type dishes in the American cookbooks are ones that we would likely see today. And some of the Christmas cookie recipes, I think the desserts have the most staying power personally. When I look through the cookbooks, I'm like, oh, I could make that. I could really make that. So from my point of view, I think it's with the desserts are where it's at, because we're not eating. That's my view. I don't know, Sharon, what you've seen, but when you look through what you think you might actually want to eat, it's not a lot of the meat dishes.
I have to agree with you. 100%.
we did find one that had in that regard, there was one from 1913. I think it was excerpted in the Mary Tenney book that Sharon mentioned. That's actually kind of a personal cookbook that's created by her, gathering up recipes that came to us as part of the Tenney family's personal papers. And so she had clipped something from a magazine, and it was a one-page ad about making meat with nuts. So like a kind of a fake fish, and then a couple different dishes, which Sharon and I think both cathected to as vegetarians. We were like, oh, so
And
that
then
was
there
really
was
interesting.
a similar recipe in 1923, and I think it was called protos,
Oh, right.
which is another nut meat, which I found interesting because nothing else was like a non-meat dish, but then they had just this tacked on in a chapter, and I was quite fascinated by that.
Yeah, it's a bleak landscape for vegetarians, but that's actually one of the advantages of looking at the Middle Eastern American Christian cookbooks, because when they do have the Lenten dishes, a lot of them are, vegan and vegetarian, and then there are so many salad and things that basically celebrate vegetables to a degree much more than some of the more mainstream American cookbooks. So partly, I should say, I actually really like to cook from these. I'm not just collecting them, I'm also cooking from them.
Well, that was a question I was going to ask you, was do you cook from your own collection? So that's great to hear.
Absolutely. And I think
Okay.
I offered or threatened to share some of my favorite recipes from these books.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah. I saw a question in the chat from Sandarshi Gunawardena about whether the collection had any missionary cookbooks. And I would be interested to know that, but I just know anecdotally, I met somebody at St. Joseph's University whose great-grandparents were missionaries in Lebanon. And she told me that her family, and she showed it to me, they had their own family cookbook, but it's not exactly a community cookbook. So I don't know if there are any, but I would be really curious too about hearing about that.
That was a question that I had and Gabriella and I talked about, and we actually only found the one that was produced by the National Church that was missionary or mission-based. But if there are any personal collections or other unprocessed collections at PHS, I don't know. But unfortunately, I mean, we couldn't find any. But that was a question I had, and I really did want to find something because I was curious as to what would be in it.
Well, I actually asked Nancy Taylor this after, Sharon, I saw your article, and I was wondering whether the Presbyterian Historical Society would start to collect more systematically Presbyterian cookbooks, because I'm sure that there are many more out there and nobody thought to donate them. And I think if you could spread the word that you would be amenable to taking these, that would be great. I mean, in the chat, a couple of people asked if I had one from St. George Orthodox in Wichita, Lebanese. I don't. And somebody told me about another Melkite cookbook from Arizona, and I would love to try to get my hands on these, but it's hard to get them because they are ephemeral, they are so small scale in production, and you just have to spread the word to let people know that you're interested. I would also say for people who are curious about this genre, the University of Pennsylvania has a big collection of community cookbooks in the Chef Fritz Blank collection. And there are other repositories that have, I've just stuck that, it's not going to go to everybody, but I could send the link. And yeah, there are other collections in different libraries too.
I noticed the Library of Congress had a little online, if people are interested, like a little online exhibit of community cookbooks. It's fairly small, but that's another place to go. And I think if anybody is listening and has a community cookbook that you want to send to PHS, put that in the mail. We would love to have it.
And so there was one other question that hadn't quite been answered yet. Well, one part of it had been answered, but the other part wasn't. The first part was, how old is the oldest cookbook in the PHS collection? And I believe, Gabriella, you answered that it was 18. Is that the right year?
Yeah, 1873, as far as we know, unless we unearthed something else that wasn't, described in an archival collection that we don't know about yet. Yeah.
And then they were also wondering, Dr. Sharkey, how old is the oldest cookbook in your collection?
So it's not very old. I think it's really from the 1990s. And I've been writing about one of the first Syrian American writers to write a cookbook, and her cookbook just came out, in the early 1960s. So again, it's not very, it's a younger genre among Middle Eastern American communities in the same way that it would be among, Muslim communities in the United States. Now it's even younger. So yeah, so it's not very old, but my collection is just starting. In fact, I only started this year with the Middle Eastern American ones because I'm getting interested in that. So it's really a young collection.
Can I ask a question of the group? Which is one thing that has been on my mind, and Sharon and I talked about a bit, which is what do you think is happening to this genre? Maybe it is having a resurgence because of COVID. What's happening with these, with the kind of dominance of the internet and, recipe sharing on social media? Is that kind of pushing printed community cookbooks out of existence, or are they maybe coming back into being more because it's so easy to sort of have a chain of people virtually that you share recipes with? I don't know if anybody has any kind of thoughts or examples of shifts due to technology.
I have some thoughts on that. I think based on the article that Sonia posted earlier in the New York Times about community cookbooks in the time of COVID. So obviously people can go online and let's say we want to make something with artichokes, and we do a search on artichokes and we pull up the recipe, right? So we can get recipes easily online. But what is it that the community cookbook gives us that we don't get just by searching? It's the community. So one of the things that article focused on in the New York Times, and that I see talking to students at Penn, is that some of them have described coming up with digital cookbooks that are Google Drive cookbooks where they shared recipes with people, but it's still a community. It's not just the open search on the internet, because you don't get the community feel when you do that. And so I think that's something important. Now, and if you look at recipes online, there are a lot of distracting ads. I still prefer to cook from paper books. And so sometimes I will still, or from a printed recipe. I don't know about you, I may look for a recipe on the web, but I print it out. So I think there's still a life for it. I meant to show you this. I wanted to show you like one of my most cherished cookbooks, hands down, is this one. It's from 2012. My students, this is the code number for my course at Penn. The students in my course, as a present to me at the end of the semester, created a community cookbook for me, and they each contributed a recipe with a little story, and they printed it out on different colored paper, and they gave it to me at the end. And it's really meaningful to me to have this. And I don't think if it were in a Google Drive, it would feel the same way. So there's something about the tangibility of the book that I think is important. And right now I'm actually in the process of developing a community cookbook with one of my classes at Penn as well. And we're going to donate it to the university archives, but I'm actually seriously thinking about, printing it, forking out the money and printing it out and mailing them by physical mail, a copy, because I think it will be meaningful to have that as we go on.
I love that. I've lost my train of thought. Sharon, were you about to say something, or did I? Okay. I had another thought about. Just that I noticed at PHS, that was it, that and somewhere in our network drive, we have this folder of recipes that staff have contributed, including staff that are long gone that I've never met in my time at PHS. And while we were working on this, I thought about that kind of as a PHS community cookbook as well, that little slice of our shared drive we have. So
maybe you need to print it out and actually do something with that.
Yes. Are there any other questions, Sonia?
Yes, there are a few more. I guess the next one we'll do is, do we have, with Montreat Heritage Center, do you know if they have a cookbook collection? And if they do they have cookbooks of Southern churches before reunion in the 1980s?
I don't know if they do. They transferred most of their archival materials to PHS or to other repositories at the point of reunion, but I don't know what became of all of their book collection. I know we have portions of it. So it's possible that some of the things we're talking about tonight actually originated out of Montreat, out of that collection. But what their status is now, I don't know. They do have a web presence, so if the questioner was interested, you might be able to find something on their website, or at least a contact person.
And in the Q&A section, we have a question, where is the earliest cookbook from? So I guess that 1873 cookbook that they might be referencing, that's in the PHS collection. Do you know where that one was from? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
I don't. I might be able to find out if I can disappear for a moment. But I guess one thing I will say, as we're kind of approaching the end of our time together, is let me just put up this slide so you guys can see some contact info. If you have follow-up questions that we don't get to, or that we haven't answered tonight, you can always send them to refdesk@historypcusa.org. That's our staffed by our reference archivist. And if it's a particular question of Sharon about something she said, they'll just forward it on. Or if it's just a more general question, that you could send them all there, and then they'll get sorted out as need be. And then I also wanted to include the link, because I think we really would love people to come use this collection and make something of it. I think Sharon and Dr. Sharkey's presentations both, just generated a ton of kind of ideas of things you might study through these cookbooks. So if you're interested in coming in to PHS, we do have limited research hours right now because of COVID, but we do have 2 appointment slots a week. And you can read more about that at that link, the Plan Your Visit link on our website. So that may be useful to you.
Right.
And then I just want to say just a tremendous thanks to both Dr. Sharkey and Sharon, who just blew me away with the kind of information about community cookbooks. It's really, even though I've been talking to Sharon, I still kind of learned things tonight that I didn't know.
Well, it's really exciting for me to get to talk about it, and you forced me to think through some of my developing ideas. I saw we had one question about the difference between family and community. I just say, community is a family on a larger scale. And what's really so powerful about reading community cookbooks now at our time of isolation, when we tend to be able to interact with so few people, is it's also amazing to imagine a time when people were getting together for big banquets. And it's really touching and really powerful to look at that now and to remember that. And then to also see references to people saying, I got this recipe from my grandmother and it was something we made every, Easter or something like that. And it's really powerful and beautiful to be able to look at community cookbooks for that kind of information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, there may be still a few questions trickling in, but I also, I don't know if we need to let folks carry on the rest of their evening.
Yeah, I was going to say, if anyone has any additional questions, we can, as Gabriella mentioned, you are welcome to send those questions in to us, and we will forward those along to the appropriate staff that can help you with that question. And we will be sending out a recording of this particular talk. And usually with that recording, we also send out additional resources. So we'll be able to share information that we've shared in this talk will be shared in that email as well. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, Dr. Sharkey, if you have a favorite recipe you want to share with that, or several, that would be, we would love to have that be part of that kind of packet we send out to folks.
Okay, I'll start typing them up.
Oh, awesome. Great. Thank you.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.
Have a good evening, everyone.